Howdy everyone, welcome to yet another video in which I waffle inanely about watches. And this time it's going to be about the Oris Big Crown Pointed Date. I'll give you my thoughts about the watch, its general features, and whether or not it's worth considering. And if you've got any thoughts about the watch, well let me know that in the comments below. Now before we get started, today I'm wearing my Girard Genta Day Night. It's a slightly interesting watch from a brand that you don't see every day, so I kind of thought it was a little bit unique, and hence why I'm wearing it and hence why I picked it up. But in any case, let's get back on topic and talk about the Oris. So what exactly is the Oris Big Crown Pointed Date? Well, its main claim to fame is that instead of having a date window and a date wheel in it, rather it has a date hand. And around the circumference of the dial, well, we can see various dates, and the date hand will go around pointing to the date that it is. And that's the main point of difference from all of the other watches, hence why it's called the Pointed Date. Now, obviously that might be a little bit gimmicky. After all, is that really that different functionality-wise from having a date wheel or a date window or whatever the case might be? But at least is a little bit unique. And that's really why this watch exists, to have that function. Now to be clear here, if we look at the actual movement underlying the watch, the movement isn't that unique per se. We have an Oris movement here. However, the Oris Caliber 754 is really based off a Sellita SW200. So it's kind of worked upon a workhorse movement. It isn't necessarily that unique movement-wise, but at least a little bit unique aesthetics-wise. Now that workhorse movement is going to be relatively robust, so that does add some confidence. It's not as if they've just bodged together a movement that is likely to break, or at least it probably won't anyway. So that's what the Oris is, but let's have a little bit of a dig deeper into some of the other features. So what about the appearance? Well, the Big Crown Pointed Date comes in several color waves. What I have is the steel and rose gold color wave, but of course you can get it in myriad other versions as well. Now there are a couple of things I like and dislike about the color wave. The thing that I like is I like the dial, I like the face of the watch, I like the front of the watch, and I like the bezel. I think that the rose gold bezel work actually functions quite well. I think the texturing on it helps to remove the shininess and kind of fakeness that you sometimes see in some metals. It is, however, worth noting that you can get multiple different color waves, and of course you could replace the bracelet with a leather strap or anything else. So it's not as if you're just stuck with that bracelet, you can actually swap it out. Now if we focus on the dial itself, well the dial is white, or at least a little bit off-white, and it has some texturing around it. The texturing is effectively in a ring around the dial, which looks quite pleasant. It helps to add nuance and texture and a point of difference from just a plain white dial. I think that if you had this 40mm watch with no other stuff in the dial and it were just white, that would look a little bit boring. However, the texturing helps to add to the appearance of the watch. I do quite like that. If we look at the actual markers around the watch, well, there's obviously no lume. Those markers, again, are in that rose gold color. Now, the markers themselves are nice as far as they go, but don't expect to be able to see this late at night because the lume won't be there to actually help you see it. But nevertheless, they function perfectly well as markers. I have nothing particularly untoward to say about those. However, I think the dial and the front of the watch does look quite nice. Now, if we go around to the side of the watch, we can see that the crown is signed, which again is a nice touch. Around the back of the watch, we have a clear display case back, which again is a nice touch. Probably you will never actually see it, but it is nice to have the display case back. Now, the movement itself is not that heavily decorated. It's not as if this is an intricately marked movement that is going to be a masterpiece. Rather, it's just kind of pleasant to look at. Hence why I'm neither here nor there about whether there is a display case back on this watch, but I guess it is nice to have. Now, if we look around the bracelet, I've already talked a little bit about my thoughts about the appearance of it. Now, again, that's entirely subjective. You might like a bracelet of that nature. I'm not the biggest fan, but nevertheless, if we go around the bracelet, it works nice enough. The texturing of it is nice enough. I don't mind the design generally. The actual buckle, again, functions perfectly well. It's a relatively easy to use buckle. It snaps into place. It functions kind of like you would expect to function. Nothing particularly unusual. It's a handsome buckle. It's kind of nice. So the bracelet overall, other than my comments about its shininess, I don't actually dislike. Now, in terms of how you actually operate the watch, well, it operates much like you would expect. You have the crown, you get the crown out, then you can move the hour and the minute hands. That's kind of normal. You can also move the date marker. Again, that's kind of normal. The date marker can sometimes be a little bit fiddly. It's a little bit annoying. It sometimes seems to get a little bit stuck between dates, but of course you can kind of sort that out, but that's a little bit annoying. But nevertheless, it functions kind of how you would expect it to function. So instead of having a date wheel that you might see in a magnified window, you have a date hand. So the functionality is basically the same, which is what you would expect given that the movement is based on the Sellita SW200. So that's overall the watch. I kind of like its appearance. It's a little bit different from every other watch that people are wearing. It looks kind of nice. But again, it wasn't my personal aesthetic, so yeah, it's really going to be a matter for what works for you. What about the sizing? How big is the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date, and how does it compare to other watches? Well, as I indicated, it's 40mm across. However, when you include the crown, it's a little bit bigger, so it is roughly true to size. Now, say we compare it to, say, a 36mm Rolex Datejust or a 34mm Rolex Air King, well, we can see that the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date is noticeably bigger. So if you prefer the 36mm Datejust, well, the Oris is going to be bigger than that. It might be too big for you if you prefer the 36mm, or it might be the right size if you think the 36mm is too small. And in any case, that's roughly where the sizing sits. I think it's a perfectly adequate size. I find it comfortable to wear. I think it's an appropriate size, and I quite like it in that respect. Even if I had some other misgivings about other aspects of it, I think that the sizing works, and I think it functions perfectly well when you're wearing it under a sleeve, for example. This leads me to the important question of, should you buy the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date? Well, I'm not going to tell you what to buy per se. What you buy depends on your personal taste and what you want to get out of a watch. However, I would note that brand new, you are likely to lose quite a bit of money on depreciation on this. They retail for a lot more than they seem to sell for in the secondary market. If you go to eBay or you go to Chrono24, you're likely to pick them up for much less money than you would have spent from Oris itself. So if you were to go brand new, you want to try to pick up a bargain from either Oris directly or another grey market dealer. Or alternatively, you might just want to pick it up secondhand because you'll probably save a lot of money on a watch that is essentially the same. And that's probably the path that I would go down personally, because I personally prefer to not lose money on assets that I buy. Now, it is worth noting that the Oris is not a very expensive watch in the grand scheme of things. It's not in Rolex territory or anything like that. However, it isn't cheap either. And if you're going to be buying it and losing quite a bit of money on depreciation, one has to ask oneself, is it better to just pay a little bit more, maybe save up a little bit more, and buy a watch that is possibly going to depreciate less, both in dollar and percentage terms? So consider exactly what you want to get out of the watch. If you really like the Big Crown Pointer Date, then certainly go ahead and buy it. It's not a bad watch. I think it looks okay. I kind of find the functionality kind of unique. I like the dial in particular. However, bear in mind that you'll probably lose money on this, and you might be better served just going to the second-hand market and buying something from a reputable dealer or something that you personally have confidence with through a reputable source. But certainly I'm happy to have tried it out. I don't regret the purchase given what I paid for the watch, and I'm relatively pleased with it. But of course, do bear those caveats in mind if you're going to go out and buy the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date. So what about specific alternatives? Well, like I've indicated, I would probably actually pay a little bit more than the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date because I'd probably look for something that is likely to hold value. So I'd probably go a little bit above this and say look at Tudors, for example, because the Tudor might hold a little bit more value, particularly if you buy strategically and appropriately in the second-hand market, and it will be significantly easier and quicker for you to ultimately sell. Or you could look at used Omega Speedmasters, which again are quite a nice watch. I've had one myself. I personally would go out and buy another one, and I think those as well could hold value, particularly if you buy it well and buy a good quality second-hand one that is in good condition and has already had its depreciation cycle. So I would be looking at the Omega Speedmasters or some of the used Tudors instead of going out and buying an Oris Big Crown Pointer Date. But again, it really depends on exactly what you are looking for with your watch and exactly what parameters are really going to shape your decision making. Do you care about whether depreciation really starts to bite in? Or do you care more about having the aesthetics and appearance of the Big Crown Pointer Date? What do you care about when you are buying the watch? And that's really going to be a personal decision for you to make. And again, like I've said, I'm happy enough with my purchase, given what I paid for the watch, but I would not have gone out and paid full retail for it. Nevertheless, that's my thoughts about the alternatives and whether or not it's worthwhile going out and considering. If you've got any thoughts about this watch, any thoughts about what you should buy instead, well, let me know that in the comments below. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you next time as well.